Tensions rise between India and Pakistan following a terrorist attack in the Kashmir region. China faces significant economic fallout from its trade war with the United States as opposition to Xi Jinping increases. And finally, where do we draw the line with right-wing wokeness? You're listening to Mensch-Kight Geopolitics. Mensch-Kight Geopolitics is your home for conservative commentary on international affairs with an eye toward Israel and the Middle East. I'm your host, Isaac Kite, your lovable bondsman, your gregarious Vulcan, your mad genius, your shadow president, and your prophet of things to come. Welcome back, insiders and Mention. Hope you're enjoying the new branding and the new look and feel for the podcast. Slightly different format too. So that will be interesting to see how this goes. I'm up in the air about it. I'm hoping you guys like it. Let me know. You can find Mensch-Kight Geopolitics on X, and it's still Inside Israel News on Facebook if you want to go there. In any case, there are ways to reach out, ways to be in touch. But please do let me know what you think. All right. Wow. Just like everything this week, I wanted to take my time and talk about the Douglas Murray and Smith debate and the whole Joe Rogan thing, Jordan Peterson and lots of stuff coming up about right-wing wokeness and all this. Konstantin Krysin has had something to say about it, and that is just, there's so much, absolutely so much to talk about. However, there are more important things to talk about first, so I will come to all of that a little later, but we'll get there. There's definitely lots of fun to talk about. Also, more stuff on tariffs and what have you. But first, the world's going crazy. There's lots of stuff going on that's just incredibly relevant. So in this segment, I'm going to talk about the Ukraine ceasefire and the Trump administration's pressure on Iran a little bit. Then I'm diving into India and Pakistan because that's a mess. And then I have a lot to talk about on China, probably in the second segment. And then I'll do what I can on right-wing wokeness and all that stuff. But there's so much. There is so much. So I'm trying to make these more often so that it doesn't get to be too much. That way you can hear my thoughts. Real quick, just on the podcast issue, and I just want to make a point here real quick before I go on, and I'll talk about it more in the podcasts and wokeness and all this kind of thing later. But my goal is, to inform. Like, podcasts are entertainment. I know that a lot of people get their news from them, and journalists do podcasts and lots of great interviews and that kind of stuff. But it's a medium that's primarily for entertainment. And people forget that. And so, they'll take podcasters and think that podcasters are authorities on subjects and this kind of thing. But it's not quite that way. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later about, the value of experts, because experts have abused their power of late and been manipulative. And they've lost their course. They lost their way and become delusional, in which case, well, we can't trust experts. So we can turn to people that are not traditional experts. Okay, I'm totally good with that. That would be why you're here. I mean, like I've said before, I'm just a landsman. I did have an opportunity to volunteer in the Israeli parliament, and I've traveled widely and been following politics around the world for a long time, know a lot about history, and so I see a lot of things. And, I've tried to kind of keep my area of expertise narrow and stay focused on things, but the fact is, the more I've seen and the more I've talked about on the podcast, the more I'm right. And so I've said, this gives me a big ego. I don't mean it to be that way, but I knew that there was not going to be any ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, no matter what Trump did, before he even took office. I talked about it a year ago. How did I know that? Why is it that I know these things and all the king's men don't? Right? All the experts, all the people right and left. I don't know. It's this kind of thing. So I would say that while my primary goal is to inform, and I'd like to be a bit more entertaining, I try to be funny here and there when I can. But the fact is, I'm not a former Secretary of State. I'm not, a professor anywhere. I'm not one of those people that you would consider a traditional expert. Now, I'd love to go on the Goodfellows podcast sometime, perhaps as a guest or something. But all of those guys have a reason to be there. Neil Ferguson is an impressive historian who's had a chance to go and look at the original sources and study things. And I'm glad that he's able to do that. I put a lot of time into making these shows. I do a lot of research, a lot of learning. I have to stay abreast of events and study and all these kinds of things. My friend Grant, who does the Casual Historian show, you will not believe the amount of research this man does. He is reading books constantly. Spends so much of his free time with books, listening to things, watching things, digging deep into stuff so that he has all the information. And when he makes a show, yes, it's really good and it sounds very authoritative because he's gone and spent the time to read these things and learn and really bring you information. And he, like me, is trying to bring you the truth, as far as we can tell, as far as using our minds and studying reality in the real world, bring you what we believe and know to be the truth, not some diluted version of things, not some sugar-coated, candy cane version of events. And that's not easy to do, my friends. That takes integrity, and it takes a certain je ne sais quoi. You have to be careful. It's very easy to get lost on that kind of stuff and become a contrarian or just dive into stuff or, lose your mind. So, I'm glad you're here and I'm glad you're listening. I'm just here to inform. I want you guys to know what's going on. I offer my perspective. I'm just a landsman. I work for a living. And I'm here because I know a lot of things and I want to share that knowledge with the world. And that's the value of the show. So if I have an authority, so far it is, it's in that people like the show and people want to listen. Now, that's all great. But people also want to listen to murder mystery podcasts and history podcasts and gardening podcasts. And, they have, again, only the authority that people like them and that they're popular. Actors are popular too, but they don't actually know anything. You see what I'm saying? Just because a person is able to act does not make them an authority on something. And sometimes they get a big head thinking, well, I'm going to go fight for climate change. Like, you don't know jack about the world, right? Comedian Ricky Gervais at one of those Hollywood award shows had a great time. He's like, nobody wants to hear your politics. Get up here, thank your agent, thank your God, and F off. It was great. He's like, most of you spent less time in school than Greta Thunberg. Anyway, he's a great. That was a funny routine, and I think the best roast Hollywood ever had, especially his comments about Jeffrey Epstein and all that kind of stuff. So these Hollywood types, they think highly of themselves. So I bring you the show with great research and great knowledge and that kind of thing. And it turns out that on a lot of issues, I happen to be right. Or I know plenty of information. And I bring that to you, as honestly as I can. But that's there. Now, you get a lot of people like, Daryl Cooper, who goes out there and he reads a bunch of Nazi propaganda and spends a whole bunch of time championing it wherever he goes. Okay, he shared a meme recently, the picture of the Nazi occupation of Paris on one side, Hitler under the Arc de Triomphe, and on the other side, that grotesque display from the Olympics with the guy in blue and all the drag queens and, it's a disgusting thing. And he's like, unpopular opinion, but the picture on the left is far preferable to the one on the right. Sorry, buddy. Hitler was orders of magnitude more evil and orders of magnitude worse than the worst day of the LGBTQ woke trans nonsense. Okay? I agree that stuff is bad. I don't want it in front of my children, and that was a grotesque display. But grotesque artistic displays are a part of free societies. The fact is, if you have a free society, you're going to have stuff like that. We don't like it. We poo-poo it. It stops happening, okay? You get more of what you reward, less of what you punish, right? But, a racial supremacist regime that went out to mass murder millions and millions of people, especially Jews, that's just so much worse. So when you have a guy who's so sufficiently anti-Semitic and deluded and psychopathic that, more on that in a second, to say something like that, that's really dangerous. And, people listen to this person and people think he's right, because they hear what he's saying and they don't get the other side of the story. All of the stuff he's saying about Churchill being a villain and all this stuff, it's all exactly what, Joseph Goebbels was saying on the radio during the Nazi regime. So it's all a bunch of crap. All right, but that's the thing. And so, we get this stuff going on. I'll comment more on that, but I appreciate you listening. I put a lot of work into this. And with that, I will move on. Hopefully you guys find my personal credibility strong enough that you keep on coming back. All right. So, the ceasefire. So I said a year ago on a podcast episode, back when this was Inside Israel News, that there was, even if you tried to create a ceasefire, no matter what Trump did, there would not be a ceasefire. And I keep coming back to that. How do I know these things? I mean, back when Biden was in office, I kept talking about, how Iran and Russia were working together, and China, and I didn't mention North Korea very much because they're not very important, but they are. They're they're part of this as well. And then, as I'm starting to articulate that, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of Britain, came out and said, Russia, China, and Iran are an axis of evil, right? And it's like, I was thinking about it and starting to develop that idea, and then all of a sudden the former Prime Minister of Britain's out saying it. And it's something that's been coming for a long time. And, there's been a lot of this kind of stuff. So the Biden administration didn't get that at all. They were too deluded and too caught in their, la-la land that they couldn't see that this stuff. But at the same time, USA was also paying for the terror tunnels in Gaza, in Hamastan. So, this is, and they let up the sanctions on Iran, so Iran could finance all that stuff as well. Well, in addition to US aid. So that was ridiculous. But anyhow, so I said, when Trump comes into office, he can try to negotiate a ceasefire. But Vladimir Putin is all in. So how do I know these things? Because I know Vladimir Putin. Because I've been studying the man for a very long time. You have to understand Russian culture. You have to understand how these people think, and you have to understand their origin, where they come from. I remember very vividly when this former KGB agent was brought into the cabinet back in the 90s, and a bunch of people were alarmed because this guy had joined the Russian cabinet who was kind of a hard man, right? And as Boris Yeltsin went through his year of prime ministers, from Chernomyrdin to everyone else, he eventually landed on this Vladimir Putin as prime minister and realized that Vladimir Putin was his tough guy, his hard man, his man of steel, a new age Stalin, right? And so he got him in as prime minister and then resigned at the end of 1999, at the turn of 2000, and left the office to Vladimir Putin. And that's where we are. But I've been watching what the guy did from there. He has rigged elections in his own country. He annihilated the Chechens. I mean, that was his way of winning the Second Chechen War. Was just genocide. He's invaded Georgia. He's threatened a bunch of different countries, and now he's invaded Ukraine twice. So, when you understand what this guy's goals are, to recreate the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire, you understand what he's going to do. Right, he's going to take Ukraine if he can, then he'll start moving in on Romania and the Baltic states, and then he'll move into Poland. And when I say move in, he'll interfere in their politics. He's already interfered in Romanian politics. This guy, Georgescu, he did everything he could to get this guy elected, who's, it's a total fruitcake is what he is. Of all the people who've been denied the ballot, they tried to get Trump off the ballot, Bolsonaro, Marine Le Pen, all these people, some of them so none of those people deserve to be taken off the ballot. I'll just say that right there. But this guy, Georgescu, definitely should be taken off the ballot because he's nuts. He's not some right-wing populist. He's a real nutter and pro-Russia. And that's dangerous. That's really dangerous. But if Russia can get a politician in who is favorable to them, then they'll use that as a shoe-in to get into their politics. If they can't do that, then they will invade. and there will be military conflict, and we'll be faced with the decision, right? Do we, fire our nuclear weapons at Russia? They'll make it, they'll escalate like that and leave us with some really dark choices. And already we hear, Musk and Senator Mike Lee and people calling for the dissolution of NATO. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin would love nothing more. Our country's enemies would love nothing more to see us abandon our allies and isolate ourselves so that we can't call upon their support if we need it against them, right? So, knowing what Vladimir Putin's goals are, a ceasefire is incompatible with those goals, anything short of capturing Ukraine. So he gives his 6 points peace terms of what he wants. And the very first one shows you what Russia's goals really are. I mean, the Russians they're really good at negotiating, and they're really good at propaganda, and they're good at delay tactics and this kind of thing, playing hardball. They are pros at that. They were pros at that during the Soviet Union, during the Soviet era. And more than once, Reagan had to and his negotiating team had to walk out because the Russians would play these games, and they'd manipulate things. Well, Putin said everything in this first thing, right? His first stipulation for a ceasefire was that Ukraine pull back from all of the regions that Russia is claiming. That's all of Kherson, all of Zaporizhia, all of Luhansk, and all of Donetsk. Right now, Russia has a little more than half of each, right? That's where the front lines are. And they want the Ukrainians to pull back and give each oblast basically means district in Russian, give each oblast to Russia. And obviously the Russians are doing everything they can to get Ukraine out of Kursk Oblast, although the Ukrainian troops are holding on there. And the Ukrainians also have a little piece of Belgorod Oblast. So they're actually occupying a little bit of Russia, as it were. This is utterly ridiculous. And they go down from there with stipulations, basically saying they want to halt arms shipments to Ukraine. So they want to give themselves a strategic position inside Ukraine, deeper in. So they're going to get the Ukrainians to retreat hundreds of kilometers, including across the Dnipro River, giving the Russians strategic launching point for the next war. They want no weapons going into Ukraine, and they want to limit Zelensky's power. And they're like, well, he's not a legitimate president. This is all completely delusional. But what it gives away is their goal, right? Russia does not want peace. They want Ukraine. And that's the point. So Putin can't stop. He's bet the whole country. He has bet the farm. He is all in on this thing. I know that. Anyone who's an expert on Putin knows that. Stephen Kotkin, who's wrote the biography on Stalin, he's an expert on he knows that, right? Again, back to experts. So a lot of my knowledge comes from these experts. And as I've told you, I mean, you get analysis here that's at least as good as people like the Goodfellows podcast and Stephen Kotkin, because I have pretty good analysis, and I'm right, even when they're wrong sometimes, when they have the wrong perspective. They took a position on these tariffs that, it was a bad thing for the country and all this kind of thing. They're wrong. And I'm right on that. So, and that's all going to be borne out as we go forward. Anyway, my point is you get really good analysis here. And, it's high quality without the stuffy, elitist academic attitude. Let's just put it that way. Much as I like these guys, they can be a little hard to listen to sometimes. So now there is no ceasefire, and some odd reason Zelensky keeps being blamed for this. This has nothing to do with Zelensky. The Russians started the war. The Russians don't want to give up. Okay? That they want to conquer Ukraine. They're all in on that, and they're not going to stop. So the best thing we could do now is send more weapons to Ukraine. And, this is where things get disappointing. The Ukrainians, with money sent to them by Europe, offered to buy Patriot missiles from the United States. That's jobs and economic growth here in the United States. With European money, that's not even our money, Ukraine offered to buy them. And Trump said no. That's extremely disappointing and going in completely the wrong direction. The administration has been wrongheaded on this policy from the beginning. That's my major criticism. And I'm not letting up on this. This has been amateurish and childish. Donald Trump has made himself look like a complete imbecile. in this process. He's let the Russians play him. He is, he looks like a rank amateur. And he's supposed to be this art of the deal guy, so it's not good look for him. As he's playing hardball with China and with Iran, which he looks strong on those. Clearly he knows something of what he's doing, but when it comes to Russia, for some reason, he just doesn't, he doesn't get it. And so I have been critical, as I've said. I'm your shadow president. I will continue to offer different advice. And, what would I have done in his stead? I talked about it a couple episodes back. I would have started with increasing the sanctions on Russia and getting Europe to buy more of our gas, oil and gas, which, there's no downside to that. Jobs and economic growth for Americans and our working class, right? And I sent more weapons to Ukraine. Finally, we're getting some sensible numbers on Ukraine. The U.S. has now reduced its estimate of the aid sent to Ukraine from $350 billion, a number that Donald Trump was touting that's utterly ridiculous, to about $105 billion, which is a number the Ukrainians are in agreement on. And again, that's not $105 billion in cash that was just sent to Ukraine. Almost all of that, 90% of that, is in weapons. Like we took caches of weapons that were here, old weapons that we were going to have to pay to dismantle. And it's more expensive to dismantle it than to ship it. And we saved ourselves money by shipping it to Ukraine where they could use it. So we don't have to dismantle it or dispose of it, right? So we sent them, it's what's called in kind. And so what you do then is you say, all right, we've got this case of Javelin missiles. It's worth $1 million. $10 million, something like that, let's say $1 million, and we ship it to Ukraine. So we've given $1 million in aid to Ukraine. In fact, we have given them no money. We have given them a Javelin missile, a box of Javelin missiles, right? Anti-tank missiles. So that's the aid that went to Ukraine. There was some money given to Ukraine, but not a lot. The financial aid to Ukraine has not been great. And Europe has lent a bunch of money to Ukraine and given them money as well. Europe has given about as much as the U.S. Now, I just want to take a second there and say the $100 billion in aid we gave to Ukraine has done more to improve America's security than the trillions of dollars we've spent on our defense budget for the last 30 years, right? What looked like on paper the second most powerful military in the world has turned out to be a paper tiger. Ukraine has decimated it. Well, more than decimated it. They've devastated the Russian military. The Russians don't have any armored vehicles anymore. Very few, let's say. They are carrying logistical supplies to the front line on mules and in golf carts because they don't have the armored vehicles to bring ammunition to the front and supplies. Right? Because the Ukrainians have destroyed so many, and the Russians are running out of tanks. They've been activating old T-64s and T-55s to fill in and supplement, putting modern scopes and stuff on them. But even so, they're losing a lot. And granted, Ukraine's lost a lot of tanks. They've lost a few M1A1s, and they've lost a few Western tanks in battle. But they have also, just ground down one of our greatest enemies. And one more time, Russia is one of the greatest threats to the United States, right? We have all these nuclear weapons because of Russia. Like China's nuclear stockpiles are a fraction of those in Russia. If we were just trying to deter Russia, we would only need, or China, excuse me, if we're only trying to deter China, we'd need missile defense and, a submarine at sea, basically. That would deter China. So, we have all of these weapons, all these ICBMs and our bombers and all of our submarines and all that because of Russia. Anyway, so what we should do now is we should continue arming Ukraine. Now, the mineral deal, I'm more than happy. I don't like the idea, but I'm more than happy to accept the idea that we could say, send another $100 billion in aid to Ukraine. That would mean more weapons, not money. Okay, and they could use their mineral deal to pay us back. Now, that would be a total of about $200 million. And then we could figure out loans and deals and other stuff from there. Okay, but if we did that would, and then provided the weapons, the Patriots and all that for defense. These are just defensive weapons. mind you. They can only shoot down incoming missiles. Like, they're not designed to attack anyone. But give them that stuff and more weapons and let them defeat the Russians. And when the Russians go down to defeat, that is a huge leg of the axis of evil that is gone forever. The Russians will never threaten us again if they lose in Ukraine. When Crimea is liberated by the Ukrainians, and the Russians, leave Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and all of that, and Ukraine is whole once again, right? Then Russia is over, because they've bet everything on this. In fact, Russia may even collapse and fall apart. It could be like that. So, anyway, that's what needs to happen now. and the Ukrainians are even willing to pay it back to us. Now, usually I would think, like, the Ukrainians are doing us a huge service. They're paying us back in blood. Like, their people are dying to defeat our enemy. That what could be better for us? Well, we don't have to send our young people over there to die, right? It seems like a good arrangement for us, right? So why do we need to be paid back? But even if okay, fine, get the mineral deal there, and they can pay us back. And in the meantime, they can keep Putin busy and bottled up there, while the U.S. moves on to dealing with Iran and China. So there you go. Anyway, it's a mess. So it's really frustrating, this, again, just the wrong-headedness of this approach. It's made us look weak and foolish, and it's not good, right? America should always negotiate from a position of strength. And if we'd started it on Russia from the beginning, it would have been very clear that the Russians don't want to make peace or have a ceasefire or anything like that, and we could maybe have accomplished it. But not now. Putin, too many games have been played. Putin has realized that he can defy Trump without consequences, so it's gonna, he's gonna keep doing it, right? All right. India and Pakistan. So there was a recent terror attack, horrific attack on tourists in Kashmir, and the terrorists went through them, looked at IDs, had people pull their pants down they checked to make sure that their victims were Hindus, and then they shot them. 29 people killed, including, there's a horrible picture of a young woman who was traveling with her husband on a honeymoon, and her husband was killed by these monsters. Israel feels India's pain. Like, we've been right there. The Israelis have felt constant attacks, like this. And 9/11, right? Americans are familiar with this as well, more so than we'd like to be. So India has scaled up its military presence along the border with Pakistan and put their military on high alert, sent their aircraft carrier off the shore of Pakistan, not into Pakistani waters, and they're engaged in live fire exercises. And the Pakistanis have responded likewise. Now, these countries are both nuclear powers, mind you, so that is somewhat dangerous. But the problem here, and I just talk about this briefly, these terrorist organizations in Kashmir are financed and operated and organized from Pakistan by the Pakistani Intelligence Service, which is a well-known terrorist organization. So the government of India is not wrong that Pakistan is responsible for this, 100%. And they're going to hunt down the terrorists themselves, and they're going to hold Pakistan accountable for it. So this is the big thing that's going on. And Modi is a Hindu nationalist, so this attack on Hindus is not going unnoticed, right? He's going to protect his people. For those who don't know, Kashmir, so, British India broke up into 3 countries at the time, and then eventually 4. Ceylon became Sri Lanka, right? Pakistan became the Muslim part, including then Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh. Ultimately, Bangladesh became its own country because that just wasn't going to work. But when Pakistan and India broke up, they had a war because both of them claimed the Kashmir region. And ultimately, India was able to capture most of that region militarily, and then there was ceasefire. There have been several conflicts since then, but India and Pakistan are a lot like the Arab-Israeli conflict, except that it's between states. Obviously, the Palestinians don't have a state, never have, and they're not even a real people. But in any case, so the Indians are familiar with this problem. They've had this problem for a long time. And the Pakistanis the intelligence service has driven terrorist attacks, including an attack on the Indian parliament, for God's sake. They've done this and gotten away with it for a long time. And it's about time that they were held accountable. So this is going to be interesting. Now, I hope it obviously does not rise to the level of war. I hope it doesn't escalate into nuclear war, for sure. That would be horrifying, especially given the populations involved. There's a lot of people, almost 1 billion people in India. You had 160 million people in Pakistan. There's a lot of people. So, I don't want it to go that far. But, I hope the Indians get some victory out of this. They really should. So those tensions are rising. Now, this is an interesting opportunity for the United States, and I really hope we take advantage of it. We've just made a deal with the Indians on trade, right? So all this stuff with the tariffs, India has agreed to reduce trade barriers. And that's a big deal because India is not a country that's been playing in globalization. They've had some jobs come to India and they've done some manufacturing, but they're not interested in international trade the way China is, or being a big manufacturing power. And that's been beneficial to India because they've kind of sat out all of the negative effects of globalization, and now they're ready to go into the new era as a regional power. Now, they don't like the Chinese and they don't like the Pakistanis, so that's been there. Now, the U.S. has played this game where we've been friendly with the Pakistanis and friendly with India. India's long been friendly with Russia, including when it was the Soviet Union. And so, they haven't really signed on with any side, right? They've never been on anyone's side. There's a unique opportunity here, though, for the U.S. and India to grow closer together. India and Israel are certainly good friends. They develop weapon systems together and that kind of thing. But as we're working on these trade relationships and all that, this is a great time to build a strong relationship with India. India's buying more Western weapons. They've realized that they banked on the wrong choice by buying Russian weapons. Look at all these Russian weapons failing in Ukraine. They're not very effective. So, they're learning. But in any case, this would be a great opportunity for India and the U.S. to come to some kind of agreement and to bring India into our side, and into our camp, if you will. The thing is that, I've been talking about like alliances and this kind of thing. NATO is valuable for deterring Russia. But if we want to create deterrence against China, India would be the place to go, not Russia. If you think, you're going to do the reverse Kissinger and turn Russia against China, that's not going to happen. Xi Jinping has been too good a friend of Vladimir Putin. They're not going to turn on one another right now. But India doesn't like China. So if we could build stronger relationships with India, and we're already building stronger relationships in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, we have Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, we kind of have a ring around China, right? And keep China contained. So that would be beneficial in terms of a renewed Cold War, which I'll talk about a little bit later here. But in any case, condolences to India, prayers for the victims, and my God, what a horrible thing is this terrorist attack. And I hope India is able to get, to achieve some success in their mission. Obviously, I don't want it to escalate to war. Now we've just heard, and I haven't confirmed this, so I'm just, it's just hearsay at this point. So caveat emptor, take it with a grain of salt. We're hearing now that Pakistan has taken an Indian soldier captive. So that's even more fun here. It's even worse. So now, like I said, prayers for India. All right. Let's talk about the Chinese situation. The decision to choose the trade war is necessary for Xi Jinping because he has to save face. He plays like he's the big bad leader and no one can get one up on him. He's in charge. He's the big man, right? So when Trump started this trade thing, threatening tariffs and all that, Xi Jinping decided to fight back. Really, China's the only country that's decided to fight back. I mean, Canada played like they were going to fight back, but they didn't. The European Union acted like they were going to be tough, but they haven't, considering that, Germany now has a projected growth rate of 0 in their economy. They're completely stagnant in significant part because of demographic pressures. When you don't have any young people, you can't produce anything. Funny thing. So productivity has declined. So, Germany is at zero. They're flatlining. They need what trade they have with the US. The EU can't afford to go without it. Well, neither can China. So what we're hearing from dissidents, and this is another thing I'm going to say, a caveat on, there are people who have it as their agenda to talk about dissent in China. And they may be overplaying things. So I want to add that grain of salt and that little bit of doubt. Let's take that doubt ahead of time and just know what we're talking about here. But there are stories in China, and unfortunately, since you can't get real news from there, it's not like I have any way of verifying whether this is true or not. But there are stories and videos and things coming out of China that, if true, present quite an issue. It seems that a lot of companies that trade with the U.S., they don't import a lot from the U.S., but they export a great deal, and it's a huge chunk of the Chinese economy. But you have to remember that on paper, the Chinese economy is on paper because it's all backed by debt on vacant real estate, and a lot of their economy is state-driven. Right, like the government is subsidizing things and playing monopoly money and so a lot of the economy is that way. So the real driver of growth, of real economic activity in China, is their trade with the rest of the world, and especially with us. So now that we have the fear of tariffs or what have you, a whole bunch of people are apparently unemployed, and this is like a very critical mass of people. We're hearing numbers up to 15 million at this point. Again, I have no way to verify this, so I'm just telling you what I'm hearing, the rumors we're getting from inside China, because of course they don't let information out. Now they get a bunch of propagandists running around talking about everything's hunky-dory in China, and there are lots of TikTokers that are cute Chinese women walking around all dressed up. Look at me, I can wear all these fancy clothes, and look at China, it's beautiful. But that's not what we're seeing from the dissidents, those who are talking about this. So apparently millions of people have moved back to the countryside where they can grow food because they're hungry, because they don't have jobs. We're hearing stories of companies that have just folded overnight. Like people came into work and their bosses were gone. Factories are just shut down. They have no raw materials. They have nothing to make. They can't sell anything. And these stories are heartrending, but there's talk of gray organizations that are forming, gray because they are not red, right? So the Communist Party makes sure that it has a finger in every pie. Any organization, any association, whether religious or whatever, anything that forms in China has to be associated or affiliated with the Communist Party. If you are not affiliated with the Communist Party, like the Falun Gong weren't, you are persecuted heavily and terribly, right? So this is, this is progress, let's say, that there are organizations forming that are outside the party. Obviously, the party's going to crack down, but that's happening. In any case, these stories of economic upheaval in China suggest that may be the reason that a number of Chinese citizens have been joining the Russian army. At least one's been captured. So, Chinese men are figuring that if they go fight for Russia, they'll make money somehow, right? They're going back to the countryside. People are getting desperate. People are getting hungry. A number of businesses have closed because they can't, they fed workers and stuff, right? They can't feed themselves. So that's kind of what we're hearing. If that is true on a broad scale, then that could lead to some significant opposition to Xi Jinping. Quite possibly. Okay, don't know for sure. What we're hearing in the political situation, Chinese politics are complicated, and I've just switched over to the geopolitics format. I've never had a chance to talk about China before a lot. And I'm just going to say, studying Chinese history and Chinese politics is extremely difficult, especially in English, because there's not as much, if you want to know anything about the West, if you want to read about the Treaty of Westphalia, right, there are all these books out there about it. There are YouTube videos. There's all kinds of stuff in English and French and German. If you want those materials, you can go get them. You get all this stuff about it. But if you read about the Han Dynasty, there are very few resources available, let alone if you want to read about contemporary politics. Now, I have gone out of my way, my dear wife and I, to read what books we can by honest brokers about Mao and the communist regime there. if you're ever feeling in the mood to commit suicide, like if you want to be suicidally depressed, if you want to hate yourself, if you want to be in the worst mood you've ever been in your life, then read these books. Read about what Mao really did and who he really was, because I'm telling you the stories about him personally torturing people and having, and torturing the spouses of his inner circle and this kind of thing, just to, and I'm going to stop there. This was a horrible guy. I mean, he even thought about replacing people's names with numbers. So this is a complicated history and a miserable one. But, the worst part, of course, is that, they get into power and there's the Great Famine and then the Second Great Famine and the Third Great Famine. And, you have the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, another famine, another famine, another famine. I mean, everywhere, just tens of millions of people dying, government corruption and this kind of thing. And, you hear stories about how the regions were competing with one another, and the weight of the grain they were sending in was the most important factor in the competition. So they watered down the grain, the wheat, to make it heavier so that they could show that they had more weight of food. But you can't eat it then. It's useless. So, they took perfectly good food and destroyed it in order to show their bosses that, we're in good shape. Meanwhile, people were starving to death as a result. It's horrifying. And it's worse than anyone at the time imagined. We had an excellent video that it was put out back in 1962 by, includes Ronald Reagan, Alexander Kerensky, a number of other prominent figures in the West at the time, talking about communism and how bad Stalin was and Mao and this kind of thing, to make sure that college students at the time understood, to get information out to them that, these people were bad. And they talked about some of the atrocities committed by the Soviets or the Chinese. And it's so much worse. It's so much worse than anyone imagined, my friends. That's why I say it's depressing. If you want to be suicidal, read that history. I will spare you all of that. Let's just say there are a couple of factions in the Chinese government. This is the relevant part here. So there's a faction that's sort of, we'll call them the Dengists. So Deng Xiaoping was the leader who took over in the years after Mao's death, and he had the one country, two systems approach, where he freed up the free market and allowed people to run businesses and that kind of thing. And China prospered in large part as a result of his work. Well, there's still a Deng faction in the Chinese National Congress, right? Within the Communist Party. There's also still a Mao faction that's still dedicated to the Maoism and all that craziness. But together, they'd be a pretty powerful faction, except that they're opposed to one another. And Xi himself has his own faction, and I'm going to call them the nationalists, because their main thing is that they want China to be a world power and to get Taiwan back and all these kinds of things. Well, now the Deng faction and the Mao faction are working together, apparently, and they're kind of pushing against Xi Jinping over this trade stuff. It's entirely possible, between some demonstrations that have been happening, the economic upheaval, people moving back to the countryside and fleeing the cities, it's entirely possible there may be just enough pressure to get Xi Jinping out of power. We'll see. I mean, I don't want you to get your hopes up. Don't think that, the world is a hunky-dory place. I'm just saying that these are the rumors that are coming out of China. And like I said, I wish they were more than rumors, but what can you know? It's a dictatorship, right? It's a communist dictatorship. And these Deng faction and the Mao, none of these are good guys. None of these are people you and I would like politically, okay? So don't get that impression. But they are opposed to Xi Jinping and want to take a more moderate path. Make a deal with Trump and maybe not be quite so aggressive, rattling the saber against Taiwan and that kind of stuff. So we'll see what happens here. But, it also could be one of those be careful what you wish for things. A leader that succeeds Xi Jinping might not be any better, might be worse. It's the problem with dictatorships, right? As bad as one guy is, the next guy could be worse. I mean, Joseph Stalin was a risk taker and a very evil man, right? But Nikita Khrushchev was just, he was a braggart and he was it was boastful and bombastic, and he took huge risks and gambled strategically, more so than Stalin would have done. Stalin would have been more cautious. So in a way, Khrushchev was more dangerous than Stalin because he tripped closer to, he brought the Soviet Union closer to actual war than Stalin might have in the same circumstances. So, like I said, careful what you wish for. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's, it's tricky. So what will happen? We will see. The analysis here will continue in future episodes. As I hear things, I will tell you. But, just understand that. There appear to be huge economic problems in China, and she is under pressure, which means either he needs to produce results to stay in power, or he may have to go out of power. And so that's where I'll pick up after the break with, what are the scenarios if she gets desperate or if a war starts, what could war with China look like? You're listening to Mensch-Kight Geopolitics with Isaac Kite. Or as the internet trolls say, mouthpiece of the Zionist conspiracy, spokesman for the elders of Zion, highly paid propagandist of the Mossad. Yeah, no. Now you're messing with the son of a mensch. Welcome back from the break. Now, we're ready to continue here. I'm going to do this quicker than I had intended. I wanted to say more, but time is running short. So I wanted to discuss a couple of scenarios. About a year and a half ago, I talked about the war games that have been run on China, U.S. and China having a direct confrontation. And those war games led to several major conclusions. For one thing, aircraft carriers were expensive targets because in several of the war games, at least one aircraft carrier task force was destroyed. If Japan joined the war, it was very painful for them. America loses a lot of aircraft. One of the main lessons was better air defenses. The air defenses have improved a little bit since then, but not nearly so much as they should have. All that kind of stuff. So you have this scenario. Now, on a couple of occasions, I just want to make mention of this because this will be relevant later. On a couple of occasions in those war games scenarios, the U.S. was finally able to get Marines into Taiwan, right? Marine Expeditionary Units, MEUs. One was landed in Taiwan in a couple of those scenarios, and they were immediately cut off. So it was like early days of Guadalcanal, right? Like the Marines were cut off from resupply and support and, fighting under enemy bombardment. But Taiwan isn't really fun territory to fight in, right? So the point is, getting troops on Taiwan is very difficult. That'll be relevant for where I'm going next. So how would this conflict look and how might it start? And this is where, you have to look at Chinese strategy and their thinking. China has a huge coast guard. And while it's kind of part of the People's Liberation Army Navy, sort of like an auxiliary of that, that is a separate organization, separate institution. Now, whenever the Chinese Coast Guard goes out and does stuff, the Navy isn't far behind. But that way they keep the Navy one step removed from direct confrontations when they're pulling their shenanigans, like attacking Filipino fishing boats or, Philippine Navy. So this is this is how the Chinese do things. Well, one way in which Xi Jinping could make his move against Taiwan, and this is not unreasonable, he could blockade Taiwan in a way by saying that from now on, China regards Taiwan as part of China and they're going to start collecting customs duties. Right? So the Chinese Coast Guard would surround Taiwan, preventing ships from coming and going, right? And, in order to inspect cargo and customs and all this kind of thing, as if Taiwan were part of China and it were China's right to collect those taxes. Well, if they did that, they could studiously prevent food and fuel from going into Taiwan, and at the same time make it look like they're just asserting their sovereignty. They're not invading, they're not attacking anyone necessarily. Now, if the Taiwanese start shooting back, then of course the Chinese will bomb them, and that they're likely to happen anyway. But that's a conflict between Taiwan and China, right? So then what's the US's position? Well, one thing we could do is challenge the blockade and say, well, we're going to break the blockade and we're going to escort ships into Taiwan, food and fuel and this kind of thing. And of course, if we do so, then the Chinese could open fire on us, and they'll take that to mean that we started the war. At least that's how the propagandists will go. And you might say, oh, that's ridiculous. No one's going to believe that we started the war and all this kind of thing. My friends, we have all these people, including the President of the United States, going around talking about how Zelensky started a war. I mean, it's very easy to convince people that a lie is the truth and to believe utter nonsense. So first of all, they're the orange man bad people, right? People who just hate Trump because he's Trump and all that. So you get, a third to 40% of the country ready to dive on that one, right? Trump's trying to start a war with China. And they'll, Chinese propaganda agents and TikTokers and that kind of thing will put out all kinds of messages. Oh God, the Americans are bomb. Oh, it's horrible. Oh, they started this war and this kind of thing. And that'll be miserable. And then we have the woke right. Tucker Carlson, right, who goes out there and, oh God, if we attack Iran, oh, thousands of Americans could die. Oh, it'd be so horrible. Oh no, don't do that. Cowardice never sounded so, wow. Anyway, but, we already knew he was a traitor and he's an anti-Semite. So, when people are anti-Semites, it just demonstrates that they have poor character. And then that there's just nothing, there's no redeeming value, no redeeming quality to them. So it's a great litmus test for who's sane and who's decent and who's not. Anyway, so we could have as many as half, 45% to half of Americans going around like a bunch of ching-chong ding-dongs, spreading Chinese narratives and propaganda and telling everybody, oh no, Trump started this war and the Chinese don't want to fight it and all this kind of thing, right? And trying to convince people here not to support the conflict. And that, frustrating as it is not an unrealistic prospect. Another thing the U.S. could do is blockade China. Like I said before, if the U.S. blockaded China, China brings in like 2/3 of its fuel, 2/3 of its food from outside of China. So in 90 days, right, China would be, they'd be hauling grain, hauling rice to the cities in ox-drawn carts like it's the Ming Dynasty. I've said that before, and I assert that it is true. People would be starving to death, and that would be terrible. The Chinese people are not bad people, right? I don't really have a problem with the people of China. I like Chinese people, actually, and their history and their culture, and they have their good and their bad, just like we have our good and our bad. I think liberty is better. That's why I love America. I think we're the best, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate studying other cultures and learning about them. But their government is awful, and it has been for some time. Okay, so scenario number one, right? China does this blockade thing, and the U.S. doesn't challenge it. We don't blockade. We don't try to break their blockade. We do nothing. Well, without fuel and without food, it's going to be cold and hot, cold in the winter or hot in the summer. And without food, people are going to get hungry. There's a thing that happens at a certain point when people are watching their children starve to death. And it's, it's a horrible thing even to talk about, where they start to wonder, is it really worth it? And there's going to come a day when the Taiwanese are going to look at that and say, if we surrender to the Chinese, our children are going to grow up under communist oppression. Yes, but they will grow up. Whereas if we let them starve to death, they'll die free, but they're still going to die. And that's not an enviable position to be in. So if Taiwan surrenders, China gets Taiwan. And we've already shown with our willingness to sell out, half of Ukraine, 20% of Ukraine to Russia, that the U.S. would have to accept that. that our administration now has given Xi Jinping, because again, as I've talked about, my opinion, your opinion, Donald Trump's opinion, none of these opinions matter in this regard. It's Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Their opinions matter. In their world, we're backing down. We look ridiculous. We look weak. So with all these political problems going on, she could do this blockade thing, and it would seem like the economic problems result from the conflict with the U.S., and it would help him save face. Right? And he's going to grow incredibly desperate. And again, once they blockaded Taiwan, we don't have the chips that run our AI. We don't have any more chips for cruise missiles, tanks, or even your car, right? Yeah, we might actually have a situation where people are going and giving their we had the during the Second World War, there was the Victory Garden program, grow your own food. There was also a program my dad told me about where the kids in the neighborhood would go around and collect tin bottle lids and whatever tin they could find for the war effort. We might actually be turning in our cell phones and the chips from our cars to the government to make cruise missiles with. That's how desperate we could get. Anyway, so they cut off our chips, and they can cut off the food and fuel into Taiwan. Well, if we don't challenge them, if we do nothing, and they get Taiwan that way, Taiwan surrenders, we've given Xi Jinping every reason to believe that we would let him keep it. He would be the big victor. He did something Mao couldn't do. He united China, and now he's the big man about town, right? He's the big dude. Well, that's a miserable scenario for the U.S. That would lead to defeat. We would be demoralized here. It could have economic implications. The rest of the world would stop looking to the U.S. for leadership, and we would live in a truly multipolar world. That's a terrible scenario. But that's not the worst case scenario. Scenario number 2. Let's say the U.S. challenges the blockade, and somehow the Chinese are able to hold out. They're able to sink enough ships, destroy enough aircraft. Maybe we get some Marines on the ground, but they're able to keep them isolated and without supplies and what have you. And after 60, 70 days, Taiwan throws in the towel and they give up. If we directly confront China and we lose, I mean, forget Afghanistan. It would be Afghanistan to the nth power. I mean, Afghanistan on crack. My friends, it would be miserable, and that would lead to an economic depression. American power would be broken forever. All of our enemies would be at our throats, and all the bad guys in the world would go on a rampage. It would be miserable. So that's not a positive scenario. That's a very negative scenario too. So it's like the first scenario, they blockaded Taiwan, we did nothing, and Taiwan fell. That makes us look weak, but not as weak. Scenario 2, we attacked the blockade but could not break it, and the Chinese won, right? That makes us look, even weaker. Scenario number 3, suppose somehow we eke out a difficult victory, because right now we don't have the right resources in place for an easy victory. We could, if we build more weapons. I've talked about my idea of the crazy horse drones, right? 20,000 drones for like $1.2 billion. We put 20,000 drones in Taiwan. And, for $2.5 billion, we could put, 40,000 drones. You get my point. But, we could have these low-flying, slow-moving, like the Shahed drones that are designed to go in and hit targets. And with that many thousands of them, that would deter the Chinese from taking action. Anyway, we don't have anything like that in place. And we're still shifting gears here. Like, we've just figured out that we need to shift to drones and that kind of stuff. Elon Musk has been talking about this a lot, and I've been saying it. The people who are on the cutting edge, the people who are looking into the future and the crystal ball, we're seeing that we need to make this transition, but we haven't made it yet. But anyway, let's say somehow we are able to sink enough ships, destroy enough aircraft, that we drive the Chinese away from Taiwan. We're able to get troops down on Taiwan and drive off any troops the Chinese have on Taiwan, or maybe they don't get any troops down on Taiwan at all, and we win, okay? In order to do that, we will have expended so many of our air defense missiles. We'll have expended so many of our cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles. We'll have lost a number of ships and planes, right? Potentially hundreds, dozens of ships and hundreds of planes, including aircraft carriers, potentially. In several of the war game scenarios, up to 2 carrier task forces were destroyed. So now we've won against China, but our stockpiles are thin and we're weak. And with Taiwan destroyed, we don't have the chips. It'll take years to get to build up the capacity to build them here. Taiwan Semiconductor already bringing $100 billion here to build these chips. It'll take years to get those plants online. Even if it were a national emergency, it would take time. to get those chips up and running. Like I said, I mean, we could be running our cell phones and our cars in to use those chips in cruise missiles. So, in scenario 3, we win, but then we come out weak. And so North Korea, Iran, Russia, other countries might see an opportunity to take advantage. Okay? That's not even the nightmare scenario. But I'm just trying to make the point here. In all 3 of those scenarios, none of them came out as good scenarios, right? It's not a good thing if we have a war with China. Stephen Kotkin was talking about this recently, saying that Cold War, the status quo, which, could be interpreted as a Cold War if China continues to push against it, that would be a good thing because it would involve a certain amount of cooperation, things, maintain as they are. That's good for us. For America, status quo is a victory, right? No change is good for us. That's the situation we want. And the Chinese want to change that situation. And, it's dangerous. If they succeed, right? If they change the circumstances, create that kind of hostility, a blockade, an attack, something, we could be in very real trouble. Okay, so and none of those, as I described, are the nightmare scenario. The nightmare scenario, of course, is somehow the U.S. and China end up in some kind of nuclear exchange. So, that would be, we don't want that. That's definitely not cool. So, but if backed into the wall and losing the war, the Chinese might, Xi Jinping, especially if he feels like he's going to lose power, might be one of those, if I can't have it, no one can things. And he could push the button and, we'll shoot down some of those missiles, but not all of them. And then, most of the U.S. is unprotected, especially the East Coast. So, boom, boom, boom. And tens of millions of Americans are dead. And we're shooting back at China. And hundreds of millions, it's a billion people, more than a billion people in China. Hundreds of millions of people would die then. So we don't want to contemplate that scenario. So none of these are good scenarios right now. What we need is a scenario where if China tries to blockade, we are able to break the blockade and we could deter them, first of all, from trying to change the status quo, but also that we would have the ability to break the blockade. And if it came to war, we would have an upper hand. Right, and that requires us to have a lot of smaller ships, a lot of drones, a lot of the things I've been talking about here ad nauseum that I'm not going to repeat. Okay, but that is, I wanted you guys to hear that. Okay, and go over that. All right, shifting gears. I have many, many things I want to talk about, my friends, but real quick, the wokeness, and then I'll close this episode out, and I'll have more time to talk about these things in the future. Okay, so we had the Murray Smith debate on Joe Rogan, and Murray's making this point. Well, this guy Smith, Dave Smith, he's never been to the Middle East. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and it's kicked off this debate. Right? Joe Rogan isn't an expert. He's a guy, you could call him an expert at podcasting. He's a good entertainer. He asks questions. He's curious. He does these things, and I'm not trash talking Joe Rogan. I think Joe Rogan's fine. I don't listen to his show very often. I'm just saying, he does his thing. And yeah, he brings on some crazy people sometimes and asks them questions, and he could push back at them a little bit more. But that's his format. He brings on people, you can listen to what they say, and, half the time you're probably, oh, that guy's a nutter, or that wasn't very interesting. But sometimes there are people like Elon Musk who've gone on there and said some very interesting things, right? And passed on good information. Well, this debate went on over the Israel conflict. And I want to say, Murray's book, Democracies and Death Cults, I'm only like a couple chapters into it. Great book. So I cannot recommend this book too highly. It's a great read. He makes a lot of good points. The first thing he said, like as soon as the thing happened, he's talking in the introduction about how, he knew right away that there would be pushback. People would deny the crimes of October 7th, and there'd be all this anti-Israel stuff, because anti-Semitism is so strong in the West. And he's right. I saw the same thing at the same time. I felt exactly the same way. It's a good book. Highly recommend that book. Anyway, but here's the fact, okay? I've been there myself. I've seen the Gaza Strip. I've seen Judea and Samaria, right? I've gone places I probably shouldn't have. I've been there and looked with my own eyes. Unless you go, and I have met a few people who've gone on the bus tour that the Palestinians have, and they have to take you to very specific places and show you only what they want you to see so that you don't get the wrong impression. But only those people come away with that opinion. Most of the people who go to Israel, especially if you're an American, especially if you have any kind of, you know, any sense of morality, you go there, you look, you listen, you will come back pro-Israel, right? You may not love the Israelis or think that they're great at everything. You may think that they're awesome. You know, I saw good and bad there on everything, you know. And personally, I was really disappointed because I am rather fond of Arab culture. I have a lot of friends over here who are Egyptians, Lebanese. You know, I love fool. I love Moroccan fish. I love the food there and the culture and the hookah and the hospitality. And, you know, the Arabs bring a lot of good stuff to the table. The Palestinians bring none of that. They are, I don't want to say this because I'm going to say it. They're not Arabs. They're not Arabs like the rest. They are because they're part of that culture, but they're not like Saudis or Jordanians or Egyptians. Not to say that those people are necessarily great or that they're bad or whatever, but the Palestinians are not like that. Anyway, if you go there, you will see things. You will be aware that the people who are living in Sderot are right over the wall, right over a security barrier from Palestinian terrorists who are firing rockets at their kindergartens and their homes. Okay, that are trying to kill their children. Right? And on October 7th, they were walking down the streets firing anti-tank missiles at buses and at people, at cars, just murdering people wherever they could. No, this guy, Dave Smith, he's never seen any of this. He doesn't know anything. He's a comedian. He has no expertise on anything. He relies on other people's opinions for things. He's not a direct expert, okay? And Murray's making the point about expertise. Here's Murray is a journalist. He is writing about this. He's gone. He's seen a lot of things. He's seen a lot of conflicts. He's been there and done that. And he has some very direct knowledge, his own personal knowledge. And I think the point there is that knowledge has value, right? As I was describing to you earlier, so I know a lot of Russians and have met a lot of Russians and talked to them, and I've studied their culture and their history. Met a lot of Chinese people, studied their culture and their history. I have direct knowledge of these things. Okay, a lot of it's from books and experts and that kind of thing. I love listening to Stephen Kotkin and Victor Davis Hanson and the Goodfellows and, Peter Zion. And I have my own people that I listen to, and I rely on their expertise. They're not always right. And I often criticize their stuff. Heck, I'll read one of the greatest, some of the greatest philosophers and historians and whatever, and I'll criticize their work. I think very highly of these people, but I'm still critical because that's how I think. I'm always critical of things. I don't just take anything like a Pollyannic, oh wow, it's the greatest thing since Swiss cheese. No, it's not how I do things. Anyway, so this has led to this debate about expertise and wokeness and all this kind of thing. And it has migrated from there, from Murray and Smith. So Jordan Peterson got into it talking about, psychopaths on the right, that there are people on the right who are dangerous people too. And, we've been asking the left to expel their dangerous psychopaths. And the left is now starting to think about, well, do we really want to embrace wokeness to this degree? How far can we go? But most of them are not, not having the soul searching. But anyway, some people on the left are soul searching, and we hope that they do some soul searching. Anyway, so there are people on the right who are dangerous, right? And so there are psychopaths out there. There are people like, this Daryl Cooper guy going around spreading Nazi propaganda. There are all these people challenging, Churchill, and they're trying to destroy morality and destroy the narratives that have of morality and decency that have driven the West and the Western right for some time. And I've talked about that before myself. You've listened on this podcast if you've heard it. I've been, critical of Tucker Carlson and people like him and this Daryl Cooper neo-Nazi nutter. And, there has to be a line. There has to be a point where we accept this is reality and that is not. And that's what Peterson's talking about. Where do we draw this line? I always draw the line at, there's a place for sensible commentary and a place not. Why? Because I've read Walter Lippmann, and I've told you guys about Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann puts considerable amount of time into who do you listen to? Who influences you, right? Who influences the public, right? Newspaper articles in his time, somebody reads this periodic, somebody reads this magazine, somebody reads that newspaper. People are influenced by different things. And so they form their opinion from the leadership of others. In most cases. Well, social media doesn't change that. You have access to more information, but people still follow the leader, right? personally, I don't want you to do anything, follow anything or agree with anything just because Isaac said so. I hope I inform you, and if you agree with me, you do so from an informed point of view, especially since I try to give both sides. Anyway, how do we separate the nutters from not nutters? And so now everybody, a bunch of people are going after Jordan Peterson. He's woke. He's not, he's gone left. He's gone, and it's like the people who are saying that are also anti-Semitic and, completely nuts and out there. And so this is dangerous. I really think anti-Semitism is an interesting litmus test. It's an interesting shibboleth to decide like who could be a reasonable center-left or center-right person versus who's a nutter. Because once you get to the point of bigotry, once people are willing to believe lies about Jews, and they have to be lies, because we're not bad people. Are there bad Jews? Yes. Are we all bad? No. I mean, after all, it was at the Elders of Zion meeting last, and we were discussing a third term for Trump. Not so much. I would, we did decide that the Pope's had it. We've had enough of this Pope, and we're like, finish him off. And so we got that out of there. That's a joke. By the way, prayers for the Catholics, any Catholic listeners. Sorry to hear for your loss. Condolences. I should have said that before I joked about it, but I'm trying to be entertaining. But yeah, really, that is, I didn't agree with this Pope or his positions on things, and I really hope the Catholic Church will be, because it is in a position to be a great moral leader for the West. Well, I hope that we'll have a leader who will promote morality in a way that we can all agree with, and then Jews, Protestants, Christians, and Catholics and others can come together and say, hey, we may not be Catholic, but if the Pope is talking about traditional family values, that's something we can all agree on, and it's in the Bible. Anyway, so yeah, jokes aside on that. But the point is, maybe we really do rule the world. I'm running the Evil Eye division of the secret Jewish space laser agency. My friends, it's nonsense. And so if people believe that nonsense, that's not good. Anyway, so Konstantin Kisin is making this point, and he's really astute on this, that everyone has to rely on experts, right? We all learn from other people, and we have to rely on other people's expertise. And so there's a balance to be achieved here between what you know from collected knowledge and expertise. Okay, so Neil Ferguson can go read the original source material and study things very in depth and form his opinions, and he can write about them, right? And I can read them, and then I am more knowledgeable because I have read a book by Neil Ferguson. I've read a lot of books by Neil Ferguson. Great thinker, okay? Don't agree with him on everything, but he goes and reads the original source material and raises good points about it. Well, so did Tony Judt. And so I've read Tony Judt, and I've read Stephen Kotkin, and I've read, Victor Davis Hanson, and on and on and on. And by reading a lot of different historians who've taken the time to go study the original source material, I hear a lot of different perspectives, gain a lot of knowledge, and I can criticize back and forth. Well, Victor Davis Hanson is right about X and maybe a little off about Y, mostly right about Z. Neil Ferguson is spot on X. I don't know about Y, but he's found some evidence for it. It's a little compelling. Z, he's way off. I mean, things like this, okay? So if you read enough and you study enough and you have the intelligence for it, you will see patterns and you'll see all these things, okay? So, we have our talents in that way, some of us. I'm really good at memorization, and I'm good at learning things. I'm good at chewing on them and coming with big ideas. But we do have to be careful whom we trust with, to consider an expert, because podcasts are, anything goes. Like, from gardening podcasts to murder mystery podcasts to geopolitics podcasts, a bunch of crazy nutters there. Especially this tall blonde yid who comes on here and, talks about all this stuff. Yours truly, your lovable lawnsman. Anyway. So, my friends, I just want to urge you to be cautious about who you're listening to and evaluate them morally. And I don't have a problem personally. I listen to a lot of different people. There are people I won't listen to. I won't listen to Tucker Carlson because he's a nut and his stuff is nonsense. This guy, Daryl Cooper, I don't have to listen to him. I've already read a bunch of stuff from Joseph Goebbels because I've read a lot of books. I'm quite familiar with Nazi propaganda. I don't need someone to remind me. Thank you very much. So, listen to a lot of different opinions, but please, with a grain of salt, just be careful, because on the one hand, yes, the experts have abused us. The left has put all these people, I'm an economist, I'm a professor, and they're deluded wackos, okay? And they tell you, they lie to you. They lie to you because they lie to themselves, right? They're deluded. Definition of delusion, right? And I get that. And, we've all come away from the traditional media. Hell, I stopped watching cable news 2009, something like that. I gave up on Fox News altogether in 2020. And, we've all, come away from the media. And it's kind of been an anything goes time. Please filter and please be careful. Okay, because like I said, in Podcastistan, anyone could come out here and say anything. All right, and there's, I don't want to say a fact check, but there's no counterpoint, right? Nobody comes on here after me and says, Isaac's wrong about that and that. And I'm hoping you're listening to other people and taking into account their thoughts, and where you agree or disagree with me. Okay, so that's that. I would like to feel that I'm just adding to your perspectives and knowledge and being informative. And so you know what's going on in the world. I don't expect people to agree with me on everything. I hope you'd find it interesting and useful to you. So end of rant on that. I'm going to keep beating away at that right-wing wokeness issue because it is important, but just be aware. I've rambled on too long, my friends. My fireside chat format, we're sitting in your parlor, or perhaps, let's set a better scene. On your back porch, on a comfortable afternoon without too many mosquitoes or too much humidity or too much wind, just a lovely sunset and an evening over a couple of cigars and some scotch, or wine if you prefer, for the ladies and what have you. Whatever's your thing, okay? We'll sit there, we'll have a few drinks over cigars, and I'll monologue just a little bit. My friends know I never monologue. I never talk too much. It's doesn't happen to me. Anyway, so I've taken enough of your time in this particular episode. So I'm going to close out. I think we've all had plenty to think about. And let's see. God, I hope the world doesn't completely blow up by next week, because, a lot of things have broken loose. A lot of things we took for granted are no longer, stable. So with that, I will say, as always, goodbye, lahitrot.